Okay, in this video we're doing a real quick lecture on Chapter 37 regarding servlets. I was just mentioning to the people here in class that there are some resources that I put into the course shell, and those might vary from semester to semester, but those of you that are here in the spring of 2016 in the SharePoint program, this will apply directly to you. Couple of things that I added just this morning was this tutorial from Oracle, talks about servlets, even has a few examples. Talks about how they work, and I think they do it in a little bit clearer fashion than our textbook does. And then I also added a supplement here talking about Tomcat and how it works in relation to both servlets and JSP. And then as I mentioned also before the video started, that it's not an absolute obligation to use Tomcat to make this stuff work. You can actually use Glassfish and it will make the applications run, but I believe that that exposure is important. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and I think I closed it already, or is it in a different tab here? That's right here. Is this supplement that's available from the author that goes through and talks about Tomcat and how to work with it in various capacities. That is a supplement that's available from the publisher's website. You have to have that login to get to it, and I know it's a little cumbersome to do, so I just grabbed the PDF since it was a PDF and just brought it and posted it in the course shell. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint and hit on the highlights here. And these are the objectives for the chapter. I'm not going to manually walk through all of these things because we only need so much of it really to get our homework done. But I do want to make you aware of how this stuff generally works and what the capabilities are. All right, and I know the author's got his own way of describing things, so I'm going to try not to regurgitate what he has up on these PowerPoints. All right, we have already worked with forms and interactions with servers. You know, where we're doing postbacks, you have forms, you type something into them, you hit a button that sends something off to the server, and depending on what you're sending to, whether it's some sort of a script file like a PHP page or ASP page, or a Java server page or faces or servlet, there's code that executes on the server and then generates a response that we get back in our browser. This happens by virtue of the whole HTTP protocol. You guys should be familiar with what gets and posts are, and I know that he talks about that stuff here in the chapter. I don't know if he realizes that we're web people and should know about this already, because he does talk about it in other chapters as well. But you got to remember, this is a Java book, so he kind of covers some of those HTML rudiments. And frankly, if you didn't latch onto those topics when we talked about them in Web 1 and Web 2 and just about every web-based course, this will be kind of a nice little refresher for you. Generally speaking, when we request a web page, this is how it works, right? We send a request, the web server says, aha, this is what you're looking for. It finds the file, sends it back to us, and it comes up in the browser. In days past, and really days modern still, we have this tool called CGI, and CGI was a way for us to kind of do a little bit of programmatic work on the server side and do something more than just fetch a page and send it back. So it gave us a way to, basically execute some sort of script or code. And it doesn't have to necessarily be in any particular language, as long as it runs on the server, and that language then generates a response that can be rendered back within the browser. If you look at the little revised diagram here and how CGI falls into the mix, notice that there's still, that path of like you're requesting from the web server a certain document. What happens with that document will be highly dependent upon how the code is written. So that document itself may need to initiate a CGI process in order to run a certain script to alter the contents of the page or add to the contents of the page and then send it back. So it's not really dissimilar from what happens with like PHP, if you want to think of it in that capacity, or with the Java first server faces. The thing with CGI, though, is it isn't necessarily the most efficient way to do this stuff. In the past, and I'm talking like 20 years back, it was kind of like the only way to do stuff. And we would have whole schools of thought on how it should operate. But the basic point is to allow that programmatic capability to what otherwise is just a static environment. Okay, here's where he goes into his whole little spiel on get and post. Very quickly, what's the difference between a get and a post? What does a get do that a post doesn't, or vice versa?
This is all the parameters that you're using into the URL where people can see it, where it's supposed to send.
That is correct. So when you do a get, all the parameters that you're typing in are included in the URL of the location that you're going to. The post does not. Those details are obscured. It does not mean that they cannot be intercepted in transit, though. So don't make the assumption that just because you don't see them that they're not there and actually visible. The only way to really obscure things is to have an encrypted connection. But in terms of like prying eyes looking over your shoulder, things are in essence blocked. All right, so this is an example of a get statement here right in the middle of the page. He does a little bit of explaining about what the question mark does, and it basically separates what you're doing. So whatever program you're sending to, it separates the stuff that you're sending to it. The plus sign indicates spaces. All right, so one thing that you can do, and we've been doing this all along, is we can take stuff that's inside a HTML form, and then upon submit, we can take that information and send it off to some sort of a program on the server, whether it be CGI, or whether it be Java, PHP, whatever. You just have to point it to wherever it's going. Now, CGI, as I was mentioning, has a couple of little inefficiencies about it. But I think that the interesting part, and I know he talks about it in here somewhere. Okay, towards the bottom, it says a servlet container is a single process that runs a JVM. What's a JVM? Java Virtual Machine. What's a virtual machine?
It's nearly real.
Yeah, it's nearly real. Yeah, well, I don't know if it's necessarily a copy of the operating system, but it creates a separate, isolated operating environment. Like if we do a virtual machine and run an operating system within it, we basically have a simulated computer that's done with software, and then we can run our operating system and our software. The Java virtual machine is basically the same thing, but it's designed to just execute Java programs. And it's using that methodology that we are able to run Java on multiple operating systems via the virtual machine. So, all right, so notice it says a servlet container is a single process that runs a JVM. The JVM creates a thread to handle each servlet. That is probably the part that's important. It's a thread, it's not a full-blown process. So a process is equivalent to running a whole computer program, where a thread is a little bit, I guess, more streamlined and efficient is probably the best way I can put it. All right, here he talks a little bit about Tomcat. Tomcat is an extension of the Apache project, so it's designed to work with the Apache web server. And Apache, of course, is like the big, web server software. So pretty much as a general rule, if you're running a web server on a Linux platform, Apache is your web server software. That's the general rule. It's not the only product out there, though. So don't make the assumption that Apache rules the roost. It just happens to be the most popular and has been for quite a while. All right. The servlet basically operates as an API. What's an API? What does that stand for? That's right, Application Programming Interface. So what does an API do? Okay, so Jesse said it communicates with various software programs.
It gives you the tools that you need to communicate with the application.
Yeah, and I like that, the fact that you use the word tools. It gives you the tools to interact with the application. So in other words, you don't necessarily need to go in there and know every little nitty-gritty about what the application does. You just are given a way to interface with it. So you know, simplified tool set in essence, so that you can do certain things. All right. It's at this point in the presentation that I think that things start to get watered down a little bit, where it goes into a lot of maybe too heavy detail for a PowerPoint, and that's kind of my opinion on it. You're just kind of breaking that PowerPoint rule of like simple bullets. But he's starting to talk about what type of things, you know, what methods are available, how to do certain actions. And I think this slide is somewhat important because it talks about a couple of the real key ones. Now, servlets use this init method to basically get themselves running. And when you guys were working on your servlets, did you use the init method? You did. What did you use? You don't remember. Okay. Well, it's one of those methods that you use to initiate a servlet, and very much like when we were doing Java server or JavaFX, excuse me, and we would use the start method to, in essence, run our program. And even though that most of the work that we did, we were overriding that start method and then using the main method to make it run. If you guys remember that. So why are we overriding it? Now, did you know that if you actually take the main method out of a JavaFX program and then initiate the program from the command line instead of from within the IDE, it will launch using the start method. You don't need the main method. It's just that because we're working in the IDE, we need that to launch it. And if you're not certain of that, and I think that was a question on the midterm, wasn't it? And you guys probably looked it up. So this is kind of the functional equivalent within a servlet environment, same type of thing. So you'll find yourself, if you are placing in there, very commonly overriding it to make things do what you need. All right, some other key methods here, the service method, the destroy, that one's important. And as you can see, why? Because it releases those resources, so it frees up memory and processing capability. Those are the ones I really want to focus on there. Here he's got a slide about the life cycle of the servlet, and you can see, you know, and I think probably the best thing here to do is just read through what he has. It says the init method is called when the servlet is first created and is not called again as long as the servlet is not destroyed. So it starts it and it keeps running. Okay. This resembles the applets init method. Now, mind you, we didn't do the chapter on applets. The reason why is they really have kind of left, you know, favor of usage or whatever you want to think of it as. Applets got, you know, 15, 20 years ago, they were pretty common, and you still will run into web pages that use applets to execute applications. The difference is when you run an applet, that applet, the code is actually embedded into the HTML document. It's a little bit different than the approach that we're using. All right, so it resembles the applet's init method, which is invoked when the applet is created, and it is not invoked again as long as the applet is not destroyed. So very similar. The service method is invoked each time the server receives a request for the servlet, and the server spawns a new thread and invokes the service. So that's procedurally what's happening in the background. And then, of course, as we mentioned, the destroy method is what gets all those threads stopped, and then the resources are released back to the server. And he's got some examples here, which we're going to look at through the actual chapter, but just, you know, real quick, you can see that he's doing like the date and time thing. And basically, he's creating a front end on a web page. You make a couple of choices, hit the submit, it interacts with the servlets, and the servlet sends back HTML code that will render in the browser. You can think of it really kind of operating very similarly to how all server-side web languages do, if you just want to use PHP as an example. Here's another example, just a front-end example of interacting with a database. Servlets are very often used for session tracking. And you guys know what session tracking is. I don't feel compelled to talk about it in too much depth. You can also use hidden fields. And really, anytime you learn about session tracking, whatever language you're using, hidden fields are very often used to create form elements, to create that interaction with the server to set cookies or whatever method is being used that is obscured to the user. So we didn't really do a lot in our HTML classes with hidden fields, but you should always be aware that they're there. And that's pretty much all I want to talk about in the PowerPoint. Does anybody have any questions so far? Everybody's good? All right, now we're going to take a look at the actual chapter. I just want to remind you that this is a bonus chapter. The bonus chapters, plural, are available through the resources page in the course shell. You can download them individually. I included all the ones that we are not covering, and there's a number of them. And some of them are actually pretty brief. And then a lot of the exercises that go with them are rehashes of exercises in the other chapters. And as I mentioned, I think prior to video start, that the assignment for Chapter 37 is a rehash of the factorial problem. What I'm hoping to do is also talk about how to solve the factorial problem, because there's a little quirk to it that if you're not aware of how factorials work, might throw you a little bit. All right, so that's where you get the chapter. You can also get the JSP chapter here as well. All right, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to kind of skim through the chapter, hitting some highlights. I know that I have stuff highlighted in here from previous semester, and that was really because of the way that we were discussing things in that other class. So you can see the topics once again. Now, the author really focuses pretty heavily upon using NetBeans to do this work. You can use any of the Java programs that allow you to interact with servers, which is pretty much all of them. And I know that you guys probably haven't used JGrasp, or maybe were using it and moved away from it. And aside from the fact that it doesn't have like IntelliSense and on-the-fly debugging, that program actually will run all of this stuff pretty well, despite its primitive looks, including the Java effects stuff, if you guys really want to mess with it. All right, so this is kind of a rehash of the stuff that we've already talked about. That's a rehash. And here's where we actually start to look at a little bit of code. So I just want to kind of do a quick overview of this. And notice that here we are creating a Java program. So it's got all the standard stuff that we see: a package declaration, imports, declaration of the class file. Notice that this servlet extends HTTP servlet. So it is grabbing all the capabilities that are available in that class. Then when we get to this method here, so we did not talk about these particular methods. They were in the PowerPoint, but you're going to basically invoke these as you need, and there's a list in the chapter of what all these like do methods do. Okay, so one of them, notice here, is a do get. So why do you suppose they call it a do get? Educated guess. Stab in the dark. All right, but what's the word get related to?
Is it a loop that continually gets something?
No, it is basically related to the whole concept of doing a post-get form interaction. So how you're interacting with pages, how the information is moved from one spot on the web to the other. Is it embedded in the URL or not? So what this is going to do, and I think it's pretty intuitive, is this is going to go ahead and basically output these statements. Notice the slight difference in syntax. We're not using system out print line. Does that mean there's a difference in how it works? No, it works exactly the same. Why is the word system omitted? Right, we're using a different library. So notice it says Java IO print writer, and this is the thing about Java that maybe people love and or hate is that sometimes there's multiple ways to accomplish very similar things. It just depends on what libraries you're working with. And the author, I think, does a pretty decent job in trying to show us a number of different approaches. I know that if you remember the Your Vote Counts program, they were talking about like, okay, how do we put stuff out on the screen, or how do we read in information? And they were showing methods that we haven't touched. Does it make them invalid, or does it make ours invalid? Absolutely not. We just basically use the scanner because that's what we were taught in the Java 1 book, so that's kind of what we stuck with. All right, so what you can see here is now we're running a program, and the job of the program is to output the HTML that's going to render the page. So the HTML page does not exist. We are writing it by virtue of running the Java code. Right? Pretty simple. But notice that you still have to have proper document structure. So what is this example missing if you wanted to have proper document structure? What about the doc type? You guys remember why a doc type is important? Yeah, and more importantly, it tells you what version, so it knows what rule set to follow. And you guys need to have that intrinsic to your knowledge of HTML, because if you're not following the rules, the browser ends up doing whatever it wants, and that can be a problem. So, all right, so this little snippet of code will very simply execute, and then it will create HTML for us that gets sent back to the browser. So there's no HTML file on the server that we're retrieving. We are just executing a program that's writing it. Very much like PHP. All right. He does walk through the steps here for creating an application, and I'm not going to actually create the application. I just want to show you the steps. And then that's kind of going to be the majority of the lecture here. The rest of it you'll be able to work through as you're doing your application. So this is just to give you enough to do that work. All right, so they walked you through the process of creating a new web application. Not that hard. You guys should have done this a couple times now. Just a matter of making the right choices. So we would be creating a Java web application. So you see the appropriate choices here. They do recommend that you use Apache Tomcat. If you run into issues working with Tomcat, it's okay to use Glassfish. Some of you discovered that by trial and error. I'm sorry that you had to go through that hassle. But Tomcat, like I said before, is kind of like the de facto tool out on the live web. That's what people use. If you have XAMPP loaded on your computer, which you guys all should on the school machines, and that's XAMPP, located in the root of your C drive, there is a folder within the XAMPP folder that holds the Tomcat executables. So this is the folder that holds it. You do not need to execute the files here, so you don't need to actually run Tomcat to have it interact with NetBeans. You just need to tell NetBeans where it's located. You can also use the tools that are built into NetBeans to add it as a plugin, kind of similar to how we put in like the MySQL connector, for example. You can also, if you are so inclined, you can actually run XAMPP. I'm just going to bring it up on screen here really quick, and you'll notice that it does have Tomcat as a component within it that you can start and stop and run and do all those things. And if you know how to attach to it, you can attach to it that way and deploy Java applications right on your own machine as an actual web server. You do not, I'm going to repeat, you do not need to run Tomcat here in order to have stuff work. NetBeans takes care of that for you. So if you are launching XAMPP, launching Tomcat, and you're wondering why it's not working, it's because NetBeans is not designed to interface with it. It's not that it can't be made to work. It's really kind of an unnecessary complexity, basically. Remember, if you do run XAMPP, that it stays resident in the system tray, so it's not a bad idea to come in and quit. Michael?
What would we do then if we want to try to use the Tomcat? You just not use NetBeans then, or?
No, you can use NetBeans. It's just a matter of how you set up all the connections. That's probably the best way I can describe it. And really what Tomcat wants within the XAMPP environment is that you move all the files and executables into that environment to execute. So, and that's kind of a hassle if you're just doing development work. But if you do want to like simulate a live server environment, that's the, okay, now what are you referring to, Joe? Yeah.
And it says you're not running with administrator rights.
Right. Try to run XAMPP with administrator rights.
And then it says, in red it says problem detected port 80 in use by unable to.
Right. Joe, don't, that's completely irrelevant to our discussion, completely. But to explain what you're seeing, when it's referring to admin rights, when you run XAMPP, you should really run as administrator. That's a right click.
Okay.
Because it does work on a system level, and it will read and write files. Why it needs complete admin access is actually a little beyond me, but yeah, I guess you do. But even if you run it, and what you're having as an issue is you're seeing all these error messages. These are relative to other things that are happening on your system. Okay, so it's very likely that you might in the background be running IIS or different web server software, or just by virtue of the fact that you're working with Glassfish or whatever. Any program that's got an integrated web server can interfere with port 80. So that's not a common error message. I mean, it is a common error message to see when you're doing this. But my point is you do not want to start and run Tomcat here. That's all that's really important. I'm just pointing out that it is present on your system, so you don't actually need to go out and download it if you choose to use that tool, and that's kind of a key thing. All right, so when you're making the selections here and you don't see Apache Tomcat listed, there's a way that you can click the Add button, and maybe the best way to do this is to just start up NetBeans really quick and just kind of demonstrate that process. And give it a second to launch.
Oh, the
Just to very briefly reiterate what I was just talking about while I did not unpause, was the fact that we were walking through the chapter. I'm trying to get back to it. Where the heck is it? All right. And we're going through the process of creating that new application, choosing Java web application, naming it, then getting to the point where we were pointing to the Tomcat server, which for many of you is not present in the listing. And if you were to add it, you would get a file window in which you would point to the root of C to the XAMPP folder, and then to the root of the Tomcat folder. Subsequent screens would also ask you to enter a username, potentially, in which case you would then go into your configuration folder here in the Tomcat folder, and then take a look at this particular file, Tomcat users, and then uncomment one of the users that are listed here, or you can create your own. Okay, that's up to you. I also mentioned that if you're spending a lot of time trying to get this to work, and you're just having all sorts of problems with it, move on, use Glassfish, and be done with it. Okay? Just want to give you that Tomcat exposure, because when it comes to actual deployment, that's really the tool that's used out in the field. All right, let's jump back over to the book, if I can find it. There we go. And then it's going to give you a little bit of an example here of what it's going to start with. So the beginning version of the project. So you notice that it does create a page, an HTML page. Notice the file extension on the page. It's a JSP file. And JSP is kind of the companion chapter in this unit. And JSP stands for Java Server Pages, which is not dissimilar from the Java Server Faces, which is the more modern approach. There are large implementations of Java Server Pages out in the wild, if you want to call it that. And one that you use probably on a daily basis, which is our Blackboard environment, is all powered by Java on the back end. And on occasion, when you are looking at some of the pages, you will see the JSP file extension that goes with it. So that's how that stuff operates on the background. Now, Jake is throwing me a question. Jake, what's your question?
Would you say that if you were starting a new project, would you rather use Java Server Pages or Java Server Faces?
Okay, well, I'm going to give you an it depends. And if I was starting a project from scratch, meaning there's no legacy systems to contend with, I would certainly go with Java Server Faces. But if I'm working within an environment where they, like, let's say Blackboard hired me and they wanted me to write a module to add to their fabulous program, I would probably need to work in JSP, mostly because that's what they're working with. And, when it comes to like large enterprise systems, they're not very quick to change things, especially things that work well. So That's why I want to give you exposure to both. And you can really see that the approach to working with them is not necessarily all that much different. It's just Java Server Faces is a little more modern, and we're going to see more and more of that as we progress into the future. So Java Server Faces is the future. JSP's got a large installed user base, if you want to think of it that way. So good to know both. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions related to that? All right. Now he's got another set of instructions here where he goes through actually creating the first servlet, and he's got little step-by-steps. And then basically what he's doing is he's adding a class to the project. He's putting it inside one of the package files. He's naming it. Yeah, and he says, add information to the deployment descriptor. That's important. Because now what's happening when you're doing a servlet, and I don't know if he's got a snapshot of the file system here, but I do have NetBeans open. But you're going to see that when you create a new project like this, and he does have, I have examples from previous semesters where you can see that this project has this little XML file here at the bottom. And really what this is showing you, very much like when we're working in Visual Studio, and we just got a little bit of a flavor in there. When we're working with websites in Visual Studio, and you start to run server-side code, where really you're building an application, not a web page, then you start to get some of the auxiliary files that come with applications. And you can see here, for example, there's a manifest file, and there's this web.xml file. And if you look inside here, it does not look too dissimilar from what you see in some of the Visual Studio files, which is basically, it is a listing of like resources that are available. And you can see that it points to the various applications, it has timeout settings, etc. So, and the reason basically why we need to click this box is because it does add that information to that XML file, thus enabling it to work with the application, as a whole. It really kind of defines the application, so to speak. All right. Once again, little samples of code here. This is basically the example that we saw before, the code that I was looking at, where he does the do get, and he's got an output of HTML to the browser. Now, in a nutshell, that's going to be all I'm going to talk about here. You can read up on the rest of it on your own. You are actually armed with enough information at this point to actually get the assignment done, and that's really kind of my main objective. So I don't want to sit here and lecture for another hour on little ramifications that we're not going to actually employ. But if you are interested in this and want to pursue Java, you should, because it is an important area. All right, that will end this video, and good luck with your work.